The people you ignore today may be carrying a story that changes your life tomorrow. The Grand Meridian Hotel looked like a palace under the glow of crystal chandeliers and golden lights. Waiters moved quietly through the crowded ballroom while a string quartet played near the stage. Wealthy donors filled the room in elegant suits and sparkling evening gowns, all gathered for an annual charity event benefiting children's hospitals. Near the back of the ballroom, Naomi Brooks adjusted the sleeve of her dark housekeeping uniform and picked up another tray of glasses. At 31 years old, she had learned how to become invisible. She smiled politely, kept her head down, and did her work. Earlier that afternoon, she had visited her grandmother at St. Mary's Medical Center. The older woman had smiled and told her not to worry about the hospital bills, but Naomi knew better. The bills were becoming impossible to manage. She had already taken extra shifts at a small diner on weekends and had sold nearly everything she could live without. Still, she refused to complain. Her grandmother had raised her after her parents died, and taking care of her felt like an honor, not a burden. Naomi carried a tray of sparkling water toward one of the front tables. Just as she reached it, a woman in a deep green gown turned around and nearly bumped into her. The glasses rattled softly, but nothing spilled. The woman frowned immediately. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Can you not stand so close to me?" Naomi stepped back. "Yeah, I'm sorry, Mom." Several people at the table looked up. The woman folded her arms and looked at Naomi's uniform with open irritation. Why do they always have staff standing everywhere? Naomi lowered her eyes. "I was just serving drinks." "Well, go serve them somewhere else." The table fell silent. Naomi nodded politely. "Of course." She turned to leave, hoping the moment was over. It was not. "Actually," the woman said loudly enough for others to hear, "get out of my face." The words hung in the air. Conversations nearby stopped. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Naomi stood still for a second, her fingers tightening around the tray. Embarrassment warmed her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been judged before. She knew that some people looked at a uniform and forgot there was a person wearing it. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. Then a low laugh came from the ballroom entrance. It was not cruel. It sounded almost amused. Every head turned. A tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit had just entered the room. A subtle tattoo curved along one side of his neck. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the woman in the green gown looked surprised. The Korean Mafia Boss, Ethan Walker, stood near the doorway with his eyes fixed on Naomi. More specifically, on the silver bracelet resting against her wrist. And to everyone's confusion, a slow smile spread across his face, as if he had just found something he had been searching for many years. The smile on Ethan Walker's face confused everyone in the ballroom. People who knew him well understood one thing about the Korean Mafia Boss. He rarely smiled in public, and when he did, it usually meant he had noticed something important. Tonight, his attention was fixed entirely on a maid holding a silver tray. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. She had never met this man before, yet he looked at her as though he recognized her. The woman in the green gown immediately straightened her posture. "Mr. Walker," she said with a nervous smile, "I did not know you would be attending tonight." Ethan did not answer. His eyes remained on the silver bracelet around Naomi's wrist. Slowly, he walked toward her. The room became so quiet that the music seemed to disappear. Naomi instinctively touched the bracelet. It was old and slightly scratched, and she had worn it every day for years. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "That bracelet," he said softly. "Where did you get it?" Naomi looked surprised. "This bracelet?" He nodded. "Yes, I have had it for a long time." "Who gave it to you?" There was something in his voice that made the question feel deeply personal. Naomi looked down at the tiny sun charm hanging from the bracelet. "A little girl gave it to me." Ethan's smile widened. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. The woman in the green gown frowned. "Do you know her?" she asked. Ethan finally looked at her. "Not exactly." Then his eyes returned to Naomi. "But I know that bracelet." Naomi seemed confused. "I do not think we have ever met, sir." He shook his head gently. "No, we have not. Then he took another step forward. But someone I loved very much talked about you for years. Naomi blinked. Me? He nodded. About 8 years ago, did you volunteer at St. Gabriel Children's Center? Her eyes widened immediately. Yes, she answered softly. Every Saturday afternoon. Ethan exhaled slowly, as though a missing piece of his life had finally fallen into place. I thought so. He looked at the bracelet again. There was a little girl named Lily. Naomi's breath caught. Memories rushed back all at once. A little girl with bright eyes who drew smiling suns on every piece of paper she touched. Lily, Naomi whispered. Ethan nodded. She was my younger sister. Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. Your sister. She adored you, he said quietly. Tears suddenly filled her eyes. Ethan smiled sadly. She called you the Sunshine Lady because you made every room feel brighter. Naomi could barely speak. She remembered the nickname. She remembered reading stories to Lily and helping her make paper flowers. I remember her, she whispered. Ethan's expression softened. I hoped you would. He looked at her for a long moment before asking another question. Do you remember her 10th birthday? Naomi's eyes grew even wider. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. Because she remembered it perfectly, the memory came back to Naomi as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. She could still see the small activity room at St. Gabriel Children's Center. Paper flowers hung on the walls, and crayons were scattered across the table beside a birthday cupcake with a single candle. Lily had turned 10 that day, but almost everyone who promised to visit had canceled. The little girl had tried to smile, but Naomi remembered the sadness in her eyes. I stayed because she did not want to spend her birthday alone, Naomi said softly. Ethan nodded. She talked about that day constantly. Tears gathered in Naomi's eyes. She asked me to draw suns with her. A gentle laugh escaped him. She drew suns on everything. Naomi smiled through her tears. I remember. Ethan slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The room remained perfectly silent as he pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn, and the paper looked as though it had been opened hundreds of times. I have carried this for 8 years, he said quietly. He handed it to Naomi. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. At the top of the page, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, Dear Sunshine Lady. Naomi covered her mouth. There were tiny drawings of smiling suns in the corners of the paper. She wrote this? She whispered. Ethan nodded. A few weeks before she passed away. Tears rolled down Naomi's cheeks. She read the letter silently. Thank you for staying with me on my birthday. Thank you for reading stories and making paper flowers. If you ever feel lonely, remember that you're my sunshine too. Naomi could no longer hold back her tears. I never knew she wrote this. Ethan's expression softened. She wanted me to give it to you someday. Naomi looked up at him in disbelief. To me, he nodded slowly. She made me promise that if I ever found the Sunshine Lady, I had to tell her that she changed her life. The entire ballroom remained still. Naomi looked at the letter as memories continued to flood her heart. She remembered helping Lily make paper crowns, reading fairy tales, and teaching her how to fold little stars from colored paper. She had never imagined those simple afternoons meant so much to someone. Ethan smiled sadly. I spent years trying to find you. Naomi blinked. You did. The center could not give me your name, he explained. All I knew was that you wore a bracelet with a tiny sun on it. He looked at the silver bracelet resting on her wrist. I never thought I would see it again. Naomi looked down at the bracelet. I kept it because she gave it to me on my last day there. Ethan's eyes became warm. She never forgot you. He paused for a moment. Every time she was afraid, she would say that the Sunshine Lady believed she was brave. A fresh tear slipped down Naomi's cheek. She was brave, she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. I think she would have liked hearing that. Then his expression changed slightly. He looked at Naomi with quiet curiosity and asked, What happened after you left the center? At once, the light in Naomi's eyes dimmed, and a deep sadness settled across her face. For several seconds, Naomi said nothing. The grand ballroom, the music, and the glittering chandeliers seemed to disappear around her. She looked down at Lily's letter and gently folded it in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Life happened. Ethan watched her carefully. There was a sadness in her eyes that had not been there a few moments earlier. I was in nursing school back then, she explained. A few people nearby looked surprised. I only had 1 year left before graduation. Ethan blinked. You wanted to become a nurse? Naomi smiled softly. I still do. The simple words carried years of hidden disappointment. She looked toward the ballroom windows, where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. A few months after I stopped volunteering, my grandmother became ill. She paused for a moment. She raised me after my parents passed away. She worked 2 jobs for most of her life, so I could have opportunities she never had. Her fingers tightened around the letter. When she got sick, I could not leave her alone. The room had become completely silent. Even the woman in the green gown seemed unable to look away. I tried to do both, Naomi continued. I went to classes during the day and stayed at the hospital at night. Eventually, I started missing exams and falling behind. She laughed softly, though there was no happiness in the sound. One day, I realized I could not do everything. Ethan listened without saying a word. So, I left school and started working full-time. She looked down at her housekeeping uniform. I told myself it would only be temporary. A tear slipped down her cheek. That was 6 years ago. The words seemed to settle heavily over the entire ballroom. One of the guests lowered his eyes. Another quietly put down his glass. Naomi quickly wiped away her tears and forced a smile. I know. There are people with much bigger problems than mine. Ethan's expression changed. Do not do that. She looked at him. Do what? Do not make your pain smaller just because someone else is hurting too. The room grew even quieter. Giving up your dream to take care of the person who raised you is not a small thing. Naomi stared at him. No one had ever said those words to her before. Most people called her responsible. Some called her strong. But nobody had ever acknowledged the sacrifice itself. Ethan glanced at the silver bracelet on her wrist. And now, he asked gently. She smiled sadly. Now my grandmother's medical bills are growing every month, and I'm trying to work enough hours to keep everything together. She looked at the folded letter in her hands. Some days I wonder if I will ever become a nurse. A painful silence followed. Then Ethan asked one final question. What hospital? Naomi looked surprised. St. Mary's Medical Center. Ethan nodded slowly. And your grandmother is there tonight? Yes. She swallowed hard. I visited her before coming to work. Ethan looked at her for several long seconds. Then he slipped one hand into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. A calm smile appeared on his face again. And for the second time that evening, everyone in the ballroom felt that something extraordinary was about to happen. For several long seconds, nobody in the ballroom said a word. Naomi stood quietly with Lily's letter in one hand and the silver bracelet in the other. She looked overwhelmed by the attention, as if she still could not understand why everyone was suddenly looking at her with admiration instead of indifference. Ethan took a slow breath and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone and glanced at the screen. What are you doing? Naomi asked softly. He looked at her and smiled. Something I should have done a long time ago. Before she could say anything else, he made a call. Michael, he said when someone answered. I need information from St. Mary's Medical Center. The room remained silent. A patient named Margaret Brooks. I need to know her current balance and treatment status. Naomi's eyes widened. Please do not do this, she whispered. Ethan looked at her kindly. Why not? Because you do not owe me anything. He smiled gently. That is where you are wrong. A few moments later, he ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked directly at her. Your grandmother's remaining medical expenses are a little over $60,000. Naomi lowered her eyes. I've been trying to save enough. By working 2 jobs? He asked softly. She nodded. I have to. Ethan shook his head. No, you should never have had to do it alone. Tears began to gather in her eyes again. I cannot accept something like this. Ethan's expression grew warm. 8 years ago, my little sister spent many afternoons waiting for someone who made her smile. He paused. You stayed with her when you had no reason to. You gave her kindness and expected nothing in return. Naomi looked at him in silence. I have spent years wishing I could thank the person who gave my sister so much happiness. His voice became softer. Tonight, I finally can. The room remained perfectly still. Then he said the words that changed everything. Your grandmother's medical bills will be paid in full. Naomi stared at him. She looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. What? She whispered. Ethan's smile never faded. And tomorrow morning, my office will contact the hospital to make sure she receives every treatment she needs. Tears rolled down Naomi's cheeks. Why would you do all of this for me? He looked at the letter in her hand and then back at her face. Because my sister believed that good people should never be left in the dark. More tears slipped down her cheeks. Then Ethan said one more thing. And after that, we're going to talk about getting you back into nursing school. The room fell completely silent again. Naomi covered her mouth with one hand. She had spent years believing that her dream was gone forever. Yet standing in the middle of a ballroom where she had been humiliated only minutes earlier, she suddenly felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. For several moments after Ethan spoke, the ballroom remained perfectly silent. Naomi stood motionless, tears resting on her cheeks. She had spent years counting every dollar, worrying about every hospital bill, and quietly giving up pieces of her future one at a time. Now a stranger was offering to carry a burden she had been carrying alone for so long that she no longer remembered what it felt like to set it down. I do not know what to say, she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. You do not have to say anything. She shook her head. Nobody has ever done something like this for me. That surprises me, he said softly. Because my sister believed you deserved every good thing in the world. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Then an older woman sitting near the stage slowly stood up. Miss Brooks, she said kindly. I am the director of the St. Gabriel Children's Foundation. Naomi looked at her in surprise. The woman smiled warmly. I remember hearing stories about a volunteer called the Sunshine Lady. She looked at the bracelet. I never expected to meet her tonight. Another guest stood beside her. I own a scholarship organization that supports adults returning to school. He smiled. If you still want to become a nurse, I would be honored to help. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Before she could answer, another guest rose from his chair. I work with a community health program, he said. If your grandmother needs transportation or additional care services, we can help with that as well. One by one, more people stood. Someone offered tutoring assistance. Someone else offered flexible employment. Another promised to connect her with a nursing advisor. The kindness spread through the room like sunlight after a storm. Ethan watched quietly. Then he noticed movement beside him. Vanessa Reed had stepped forward. Her eyes were filled with tears. She looked at Naomi for several seconds before speaking. I owe you an apology. The room became silent once more. I looked at your uniform and decided who you were before I knew anything about you. Her voice trembled. I was wrong. Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, she smiled gently. Thank you. There was no anger in her answer. No bitterness. Only kindness. Vanessa lowered her head, clearly moved by the grace she had been shown. Ethan looked at Naomi with quiet admiration. Even after being embarrassed and dismissed in front of an entire ballroom, she still chose compassion. Then someone near the back of the room slowly began to clap. Another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was filled with applause. Men and women who had barely noticed Naomi earlier were now standing on their feet. Some were smiling. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Naomi looked around the room in complete disbelief. She had arrived at work expecting another ordinary night. Instead, she found herself surrounded by people who finally saw her. Ethan smiled softly as the applause echoed beneath the chandeliers. In that moment, Naomi Brooks no longer looked like an invisible maid carrying a tray through a crowded ballroom. She looked exactly the way Lily had always described her, like a woman who brought sunshine wherever she went. The applause continued for several long moments before finally fading into a warm silence. Naomi still stood in the middle of the ballroom, holding Lily's letter against her chest. She looked overwhelmed, as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Ethan walked toward her and gently took the empty tray from her hands. I think your shift is officially over, he said with a small smile. A few people laughed softly. Naomi smiled through her tears. I'm not sure my manager would agree. Then your manager and I can have a conversation, he replied. More laughter spread through the room, and for the first time that evening, Naomi laughed too. The woman from a children's foundation approached and handed her a business card. Please call me tomorrow, she said kindly. We have volunteer programs and educational opportunities, and I think it would be wonderful with our families. Naomi accepted the card carefully. Thank you. Then the gentleman from a scholarship organization stepped forward. I meant every word I said, he told her. If you want to return to nursing school, we will help make it happen. Naomi looked at him in disbelief. You really would do that? He smiled. Compassion cannot be taught. You already have it. More people gathered around her. Someone offered to help with transportation to the hospital. Someone else promised to connect her with a nursing advisor. Another guest offered flexible work hours if she returned to school. It was as though kindness had suddenly become contagious. Ethan watched quietly, his hands resting in his pockets. Then he noticed Vanessa standing nearby. She looked shaken. I spent the whole evening trying to impress people, she said softly. And the person everyone ended up admiring was the one I told to walk away. Ethan looked toward Naomi. People reveal who they are in difficult moments, he said. Vanessa nodded slowly. She showed more grace in 5 minutes than I have shown all year. Across the ballroom, Naomi finally looked back at Ethan. I did not know how to thank all of these people. He smiled gently. You already have. She looked confused. How? By being the person my sister never stopped talking about. Naomi lowered her eyes, touched by the words. Then her phone suddenly vibrated in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and immediately became serious. It is the hospital. The room seemed to become quiet again. She answered quickly. Hello. Her expression changed as she listened. Then her eyes filled with tears once more. Really? She whispered. Thank you so much. She ended the call and looked at Ethan. The nurses said my grandmother had a very good evening. Her voice trembled. She has been asking for me. Ethan glanced at his watch. Visiting hours would end soon. He picked up his coat from a nearby chair. Then I think there is only one place we should be going. Naomi looked at him. The hospital? He nodded. Your grandmother deserves to hear that tomorrow is going to be brighter than today. Naomi looked at Lily's letter, then back at Ethan. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked frightening. It looked like a door that had quietly opened. The drive to St. Mary's Medical Center felt strangely peaceful. The city lights reflected across the car windows as a gentle rain began to fall outside. Naomi sat quietly in the passenger seat, holding Lily's letter in one hand and touching the little sun charm on her bracelet with the other. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, she looked at Ethan. I still feel like I am dreaming. He smiled softly while keeping his eyes on the road. I had the same feeling tonight. She laughed quietly. I went to work expecting another ordinary shift, and I attended a charity gala expecting another ordinary speech. They both smiled. Then Naomi became serious again. I wish Lily could have seen all of this. Ethan's expression softened. I think she can. Naomi looked out the window. She used to say that good things happen when people choose kindness. She was right, he replied. They arrived at the hospital a few minutes later. The building glowed beneath the rain like a small island of light. Ethan parked the car and turned toward her. Are you ready? Naomi looked at the entrance and slowly nodded. I think so. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and clean sheets filled the air. A nurse at the front desk immediately recognized Naomi. You are back, she said warmly. Then she noticed Ethan and smiled politely. Your grandmother has been asking about you all evening. Relief filled Naomi's face. How is she? She had a good night, the nurse replied. Actually, she seems more energetic than she has in weeks. Naomi smiled. Thank you. The nurse glanced at Ethan again. And I believe our billing department has already received some very interesting news. Ethan laughed softly. I suppose they have. The nurse smiled and wished them a good evening. Together, they walked down the quiet hallway toward room 312. As they reached the door, Naomi suddenly stopped. She looked nervous. What if she worries about all of this? Ethan smiled gently. Then we will give her something she has not had in a long time. What is that? He looked at her kindly. Peace. Naomi took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. Her grandmother was sitting up in bed, reading a small devotional book beneath the soft yellow light beside her bed. The older woman looked up and immediately smiled. "There's my beautiful girl." Naomi's eyes filled with tears again. She hurried to her grandmother's side and gently hugged her. "I missed you." The older woman laughed softly. "I've only been here a few hours without you." Then she noticed Ethan standing near the doorway. "And who is this handsome young man?" Naomi could not help smiling. She looked back at Ethan. "Grandma, I have a very long story to tell you." Ethan stepped forward and offered a polite nod. "It is an honor to meet you, Mrs. Brooks." The older woman smiled warmly. "Anyone who makes my granddaughter smile like that is already welcome in this room." For the first time in many years, Naomi felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Home. Margaret Brooks listened quietly as Naomi told her everything that had happened at the gala. She spoke about the woman who had insulted her, the unexpected appearance of Ethan, the old letter from Lily, and the offers of kindness that had followed. The older woman never interrupted. She simply held Naomi's hand and smiled through her tears. When Naomi finally explained that the hospital bills would be taken care of, Margaret looked at Ethan with disbelief. "Young man," she said softly, "I do not know how to thank you." Ethan shook his head. "You do not owe me thanks." She smiled warmly. "Then I will thank the little girl who brought us all together." Naomi looked down at Lily's letter and gently touched the paper. The room grew quiet for a moment. Then Margaret looked at her granddaughter. "Do you remember what I always told you when you were little?" Naomi smiled faintly. "That kindness always comes home." The older woman nodded. "You spent so many years giving pieces of yourself to other people and never asking for anything back." She squeezed Naomi's hand. "Tonight those pieces found their way back to you." Tears filled Naomi's eyes again. Ethan stood near the window, listening quietly. Beyond the glass, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a few bright stars above the sleeping city. Margaret followed his gaze. "Beautiful night," she said. Ethan smiled. "It is." She looked back at him. "My granddaughter spent years believing her dreams had ended." Then she looked at Naomi with love, shining in her tired eyes. "But I never stopped believing that something wonderful was waiting for her." Naomi laughed softly through her tears. "Grandma, I mean it," the older woman said. "Good hearts have a way of finding each other." The room fell into a comfortable silence. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed Lily's letter once more. He handed it to Margaret. The older woman read it slowly, smiling at the little drawings in the corners of the page. When she finished, she carefully folded it again and returned it to Naomi. "Keep this close," she said, "not because it reminds you of the past." She touched the silver bracelet on Naomi's wrist, "but because it reminds you who you are." Naomi nodded, unable to speak. A nurse entered a few minutes later to check on Margaret and smiled when she saw the peaceful atmosphere inside the room. "Looks like everyone is having a good evening," she said warmly. "The best one in a very long time," Margaret replied. The nurse smiled and quietly left. Naomi looked around the small hospital room. Nothing about it was grand. There were no crystal chandeliers or elegant gowns, only soft light, a faded letter, and the people who mattered most. Yet somehow it felt more beautiful than the ballroom she had left behind. She looked at Ethan and smiled. "Thank you for finding me." He smiled back. "I think Lily deserves the credit for that." Naomi looked toward the stars outside the window and gently held the bracelet in her hand. For years, she had believed that her small acts of kindness had disappeared into the world without leaving a trace. But on this quiet night, she finally understood the truth. Kindness does not vanish. It becomes light. And sometimes, when life feels darkest, that light finds its way back home.